Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. My name is Ted Forbes, and in our video today we are going to talk about a German photographer by the name of August Sander. Now, August Sander was arguably one of the best known photographers coming out of Germany in the 20th century, and I think you could also make the case and say that he's probably one of the best known photographers from Germany from that era as well. Now, just to put this in a little bit of historical context, a couple months ago we did two shows. There was one on pictorialism, and there was another one that we did on the photo secession and the other camera clubs that were going on a global scale, where a lot of these people were getting together and trying to really push the boundaries and the envelope of what photography could be and what it was perceived as, particularly getting accepted in the fine art world as not just a scientific gimmick that recreated images that could be captured through a lens. And August Sander is really the next generation right after that. Now, you can argue that pictorialism actually extends up into the 1940s, and you certainly see a lot of elements of stylistic things that pictorialism was pushing. You're going to see a lot of those elements within August Sander's work. But he's really the next generation after that. His career started around 1911, I believe, was when his first book was published. And really by the 1920s was really the active part of his career. Extremely prolific photographer. Sander shot literally thousands of photographs, and his subjects ranged from things like landscapes to later on in his career he was doing some photojournalism types of stuff, documentary photography, what we call today street photography, but stuff in the vein of like an Henri Cartier-Bresson or somebody like that. But what he is without a doubt best known for are his portraits of people, and that's really what lives on as a legacy when you think of August Sander, is his people shots. There were two books that were published. In 1911 was People of the 20th Century, and in 1929 was Faces of Our Time. And he was a member of a group of artists called the Kölner Progressive, which embraced this idea, what they were calling new objectivity. So this was a little bit of a radical push, I think, for that time. Now, when I say radical, you're going to have to look at this through a historical lens, because by today's standards, it's certainly not extremely radical. But if you think of what was going on in, say, the Roaring '20s, what he chose to shoot in terms of people were the working class. There's lower class, lower income people. There's a wonderful shot of two blind kids. There's a wonderful shot of a beggar, and then a whole series of occupational types of portraits they did. There's a baker that's very famous that we'll see in a minute, as well as a bricklayer that's a very famous image. So those types of subjects were something that were really not the craze of the day, so to speak, with photography. So in a lot of those terms, he was very progressive. He was really pushing the envelope. A lot of what I'm describing, some of you may be thinking, sounds like Diane Arbus. And Diane Arbus mentioned several times that he was her single biggest influence. And it's really interesting to see the thread, compositionally and subject-wise, that goes between those two photographers. She was enormously influenced by his work, and she kind of took it further and did her own thing. And I think maybe it'd be fun one day to do a podcast where we looked at the two together. But I'll say that for another time. Right now, I want to look at some of the work of August Sander. So let's go over to the computer and have a look. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the work of August Sander here today, and I'm going to use Pinterest for this. And if you guys want to go view these images for yourself, you can do so. I'll have a link to my Pinterest account in the show notes, and you can go in there and check it out. And we have lots of stuff from lots of episodes we've done. So if you are not familiar with the fact that we do that, you might want to be. I don't know. Pinterest.com/Ted Forbes is the URL. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, I've put boards together, and we have one for August Sander. And I'm going to talk about his work a little bit. So what we're going to look at today are some of his better-known shots, and most of them, well, in fact, all these are people shots. And I want to talk about some of the things that are going on here that makes him very different. You are going to see a pretty serious connection with Diane Arbus. You can see what specifically had influenced her, and particularly when you see things like the shot of the two midgets. First of all, you have people in society that aren't normally this thing that is photographed of beauty in a way, in particular for the 1920s. And he's one of the first photographers to come along to photograph people who are not in that norm and say, hey, you know what, this is beautiful. And I think Diane Arbus continued on that tradition later, by the time she was doing most of her most important work. But anyway, wonderful shot. There's just something very interesting. Another hallmark that you're going to see on a lot of his shots is the really shallow depth of field. So your subjects are in focus, and, particularly with the technology he was using in the 20s, these wonderfully lush, it's hard to tell in this because it's so dark, blurred out backgrounds. Let's look at these three guys in the suits. It looks like they're standing against a painting, and that's some of that pictorialism that you're going to see being influenced. in here. Another really strange shot. Again, the wonderful, the way it stands out, contrast against the background being blurred. But this weird shot of this kid on a bicycle, or it's a baby on a bicycle. And you see a lot of this in his work too, where you see him playing with oddities in terms of proportion, in terms of subject. And so you see this little baby who obviously would not be riding a bicycle, who can barely sit on it, and he's posed it in a way. It has a strangeness to it that really is pretty trippy. And I think that's one of my favorite shots on that. I think my favorite shot of all time that just has the trip factor to it is this one of this child on a horse with a doll. First time I saw this, you think the doll's a human somehow because it has a very human-like quality to it, the way it's posed, almost walking like that. And so clearly the everything's out of proportion in this shot. This is, kind of anti-fine art for that time. This is the progressive pushing the boundaries where you have, this small child who's the biggest thing in the composition on top of the toy horse with the odd doll next to it walking around. So anyway, I think he does such a wonderfully beautiful job of this. Here we are with, this sheep and these two kids. Again, the beautifully blurred black background where the subject is up in the front, the kid in the taxi driver hat. It's very cool. A lot of the times you're going to start seeing things that heavily influenced Diane Arbus as well with these, groups of two people. And August Saunders was really the one who started this. So we saw it, originally with the two midgets and, these kind of dual subject kinds of things. Here's the two boxers. Such a great shot. I love the grin on this guy on the right as well. And then another famous shot of the two children, which is very Diane Arbus starting to look. But again, it's weird because part of it's the technology he was using at the time, like I mentioned, but you have these kids who are very much in focus, who aren't in the shallowest of depth of field, but, on a bigger scale, you do have a lot of depth of field and a separation from the background that really is quite nice. Another thing you're going to notice, too, is I mentioned that, one of the things he was pioneering is with his subjects, was shooting people who were working class, lower class. It's a little more difficult for us to get our heads around this now because we're used to seeing shots of just about anybody in any walk of life, the good, the bad, the ugly, etc., because we are post-Diane Arbus at this point. But at the time he came out, some of his most famous shots, this is a baker, and I just love this shot, this very rotund man in this white shirt, such a great contrast, such a great setting, great look on his face, kind of a character anyway. Another big famous one that he did was this Bricklayer, which has this strange composition to it of symmetry where everything is kind of pointing towards this bricklayer's head, more or less. And notice that the arms they're symmetrical but opposite of one another, and the way the bricks are kind of around his head as he's carrying these on his pallet. It's just a beautiful photo, and definitely a hallmark, I think, of that era of the 20s, but at the same time kind of pushing that a little bit. Another famous one is this beggar. You start to see some of the triangular shapes that you see in Bresson's work, but this was earlier, and 1926. This says printed 1990 when I bookmarked it, so not printed by the artist himself. But another thing that I find that is kind of interesting is you start to see with some of these images, and I think you find this in Diane Arbus's work too, maybe on a more obvious level, but this weird sense of androgyny that starts coming out where you have these subjects that could kind of be male or female. It starts to blur that line a little bit. And I don't know if that was intentional by Saunders by any stretch, but you do see it. This wonderful shot, again, with the large depth of field in broad daylight. It's a different kind of photo than what we're used to seeing today, and mainly because the technology, the ISOs were slower back then. The lenses were of a different kind of build, and so you really see some really beautiful stuff. But anyway, that sense of androgyny, here's a secretary that was taken that looks very manly in a lot of ways. And at the same time, there's this photo of what looks like a gentleman in kind of this 1920s getup, but it is actually a woman. So again, I don't know if that's particularly intentional or not, but it kind of is an interesting theme that kind of comes through in his work, is this sense of androgyny sometimes, which, is kind of wild, I think, for the 1920s. This is another great shot of his. I just think this guy's so interesting to look at. I believe he's a farmer, have this cane and this wonderful beard. But anyway, go through, search around on the internet and see what you can find. I'll put some links to August Saunders' work as well. Here's some circus performers. It's wonderfully placed in an era, but at the same time, I think he did achieve what he was going for, which was kind of this progressive quality to a lot of his subjects, compositions, a lot of the stuff he was doing. And, if you, like I said, he ended up being such an influence on Diane Arbus later that a lot of times you see that so heavily that it looks like an earlier version of Arbus. That, I don't think that it's really interesting. And like I said, it would be really interesting to do a show to compare them because I think they're both very important photographers. And I think people miss that link of the relationship between the two of them quite a bit. But anyway, I've got a whole board of this set up on Pinterest. So if you go to pinterest.com/TedForbes, you can scroll all the way to the bottom on my boards page and you can kind of thumb through these yourself. But anyway, that is the work of August Sander. Okay, so that is the work of August Sander, and I hope you guys have found this pretty interesting. One of the things that I'm trying to do when I do some of these photolit things or these historical context kinds of deals, I think there's a large part of, photography internet culture that really doesn't have a firm grasp on a lot of the history that's come before us. I think it's really important as a photographer in the 21st century, for myself anyway, to realize that you're part of this lineage, that you're part of this canon, and that there's some wonderful things that have come before us. And we have this opportunity to take all of that and let it inspire us as photographers and influence us in various ways that affects our work, and to realize that you're part of this grand lineage of history, of what has come before and what will come after. And I think that a lot of photographers, on a very base level, they know the bigger names. They know Henri Cartier-Bresson, they know Ansel Adams, they know, Robert Frank, Avedon, Stieglitz, Stecken, the bigger names, Juliet Margaret Cameron. Now everybody knows Vivian Mayer. That's a recent name that's come up. But there really is you can dig deeper into this, and particularly with pictorialism, which I find extremely interesting. It's just an interest of mine. But guys like August Sander that come up that are really kind of that era, even though he's a little bit later. Anyway, that's what I'm trying to do with a lot of these historical episodes, is raise more awareness to photographers you may not know or you may not have heard of. Anyway, having said that, I want to end the show today with another photographer that you may or may not heard of. Some of you probably have. I want to talk about a friend of mine named Daan Hansen. And Dan has been a big fan of this show, probably not quite day one, but pretty early. And we've done this for 5 years now. His username on YouTube and on Flickr was Flipper Conning. And Flipper Conning, as I knew him, I finally met him as Daan Hansen when we got together almost 2 years ago for the last London meetup. And Dan had flown all the way from the Netherlands to hang out with us. And I ended up having dinner with Dan that night, and we had this wonderful conversation between him and Ronnie Temple and myself. And we were talking about photography, photographers, the state of, what things are like in the various countries we all live in. And it was an amazing night, and one that I cherish and won't ever forget. I remember we really were trying to get Dan on the train to go back to the hotel because he wouldn't quit asking questions. And I love that because he was so enthusiastic. He was about my age. And we kept up via email afterwards. And, I knew he was working on a book that he wanted to do. He was very active on 500px, and he was starting to do Google Plus pretty heavily. And I knew that Dan had some health problems. He had assisted income because he couldn't work, and he was literally dumping his heart and soul and all of his time into photography, which I really admired because here's a guy who really got to do that. Unfortunately, we started talking, and about a year ago, I knew he was having health issues, and he told me that he had a weak heart. And I don't know what that really meant. It may have been a translation issue, language barrier, that kind of thing. But I knew that he was all of a sudden having assisted living, so he had to move into a house, and people were helping him just because he had no energy. He would get tired really often. And last I heard from him, he was working on putting this book together. Last Sunday, as I was launching the podcast, I already had filmed. Literally, I was doing my upload business, and I got an email right then from Dan's sister, Babbitt, and chill went up my spine, and I kind of knew what it was. And she said that Dan died in July of this last year. And some of you probably knew Dan. That's why I wanted to share this with you on the show. He was very active in all the discussion comments on YouTube, Flickr group, all that stuff. Heck of a guy, and a pretty good little photographer as well. And Dan was 42. He died really young. And, he meant a lot to me. And, I've done this show for 5 years. I do this show because I love doing it. Actually, it's almost 6 now, come to think of it. It's October, so it has been 6 years. Anyway, that aside, I do the show because I love it. I do it because, when we've done the meetups and the things, I love meeting people. I love meeting people who come out and want to join in. Basically, I'm just putting stuff on the internet, and it's a conversation. And when people converse back, that's really special to me. And that is what I've gotten out of this show. I have a daytime job. That's why I do this show. And it's amazing to me. And Dan was one of those people. So when we lose one of our own, it hits me pretty hard. And I've thought about it a lot this week, and I want to do something special for Dan. I haven't decided what yet. I'll have a link in the show notes to Dan and some of his work. And actually, I will end this on a really sweet story that was part of the email that Babbitt sent me. And Dan, through some prodding of family and friends, actually got a show put together that, and I'm going to mispronounce it, but in the Netherlands, he was from Utrecht. And so at the town hall in Utrecht, they actually did the show, and he saw the show 2 weeks before he died. And so I thought that was kind of cool that, the first and last exhibition of Daan Hansen while he was living. And, he made it, and he did it, and he had a lot of fun and passed a lot of inspiration just with his enthusiasm alone onto me. And I'm grateful for having known him. And so I wanted to do a little tribute to Dan to end the show on today. And like I said, I'll put some links to his work in the show notes. Some of you guys probably knew him, and I'm sorry to be giving this news. It's never fun. So anyway, guys, once again, this has been The Art of Photography. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Later.